Not bad. 60 years. You haven't changed.
Yeah.
They look a little different, that hotel.
Is the war. And in this hotel, if you went up the stairs to the second floor, and your room was down here, as a matter of fact, there was a barricade put up, you had to step out into the open air in order to get back to the hotel. That was the condition of the hotel at that time. That was the condition.
Whitney, was the hotel a headquarters for the Americans, or was it just?
Yes. This was our social thing.
But there were military people there running the hotel, I take it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was the military hotel. King was laid down. And General Clay recommended that we conduct a trial at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. The palace, this whole town was completely demolished. It was you can't believe what a mess this place was. And there were gaping holes in the Palace of Justice and so forth, but it was big, and it had a prison connected with it. And that was a desirable fact. And more than that, it was located in the American zone. Now, the Russians wanted to have the trial in Berlin. We didn't want that. So Jackson recommended that we conduct the trial here in Nuremberg, and everybody else finally agreed, and the Russians finally capitulated, so this was the site. So I flew down here with 4 or 5 other young lawyers, the nucleus staff, in August 1945, and we established, we were assigned houses in Berg. Justice Jackson was on one end of Fort South Straza, we were on the other end, so to speak. And we had a mess hall there set up for us, so we had to get our meals there. And then we drove into town every day to the Palace of Justice, where we were assigned our office where we did our work. Well,
We're through Lakewood or Southwestern.
Here, that's right. That's right. It looks better than it did then. You're going to be cold out here very long.
History, and room number 600 is well known around the globe. And this building was made in 1910 until 1916 as a Palace of Justice of Nuremberg. And you see, if you go to the room number 600, you see a large building. At that time, the state, the Kingdom of Bavaria, had a lot of money, otherwise than nowadays. And the reason why Jackson took Nuremberg as the seat, not the seat was Berlin, but the place of the first trial and the only one international trial. The reason why is that this Palace of Justice was only few damaged by air raids. The whole area outside was destroyed, but this building had damages in the roof and windows and so on, but in the essential part it was undestroyed, and that was my own. Whitney Harris told you this matter yesterday in the afternoon, and now come follow me to the famous room 600. Spiritus Rector of all. And now let's go up one. Please in the front. Better than
That's where he was? Right
Yep,
there?
right there. That's way too cool.
And 1949, this courtroom saw the trials of the United States, not the international, but the United States military tribunal against politicians, military personnel, businessmen, doctors, lawyers, members of the Foreign Office, and others. Held to answer for crimes that had been committed by themselves or on their orders, crimes like waging prison wars, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. In the time before 1945, the law of nations knew only the responsibility of the states, but not of the statesmen. In the years after the beginning of the Second World War, it was an arduous task to realize the idea of a trial against the principal war criminals. In January 1942, at a conference in London, the first step was taken to formulate a program for the treatment of war criminals. And the conference consisted of representatives of the following representing from the following countries, of representatives of the countries occupied by the Germans: Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, Greece, Netherlands, Yugoslavia, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, etc. And in this St. James Palace Declaration of January 13, 1942, the participants of the conference established that one of the most important goals of the war was the punishment of those responsible for crimes in a court of law, irrespective of whether those concerned were guilty solely or jointly for these crimes. By acknowledging the St. James Declaration, the USA, Great Britain, and the USSR 1942, the United Nations War Crimes Commission assembled for the first time. It became an important center for war crime affairs. It received and registered submitted by member states and published list of war crime suspects. And on November 1st, 1943, at the Moscow Conference, Great Britain, the USSR and the USA published the Declaration of German Atrocities in Occupied Europe and by the Allied governments. And this formed the basis for the later agreement on which the Nuremberg trials and the other international trials, for instance in Tokyo, were held. As the war in Europe was nearing an end, it became evident that the treatment of war criminals would be one of the most important tasks in the creation of peace. During the conference of San Francisco at the beginning of May 1945, diplomatic representatives of the four allies conducted talks about the establishment on an international military tribunal for the trials of the principals European war criminals. In the USA, the Federal Supreme Court Judge Robert Jackson, was appointed by President Truman on May 2nd, 1945, to conduct binding negotiations concerning the upcoming trial. At the same time, he was designated head of the United States prosecution. Jackson had occupied himself for some years with the problem of personal responsibility of leading members of the Nazi government. Jackson gave public evidence of his thinking on war crimes. Jackson said, "I have no purpose to enter into any controversy as to what shall be done with the war criminals, either high or humble. If it is considered good policy for the future peace of the world, if it is believed that the example will outweigh the tendency to create among their own countrymen a myth of martyrdom, then let them be executed. But in that case, let the decision to execute them be made as a military or a political decision. Of course, if good faith trials are sought, that is another matter. I am not troubled as some seem to be over problems of jurisdiction of war criminals or of finding existing and recognized law by which standards of guilt may be determined. But all experience teaches that there are certain things you cannot do under the guise of judicial trial." Famous sentence. Courts try cases, but cases also try courts. You must put no man on trial before anything that is called a court under the forms of a judicial proceeding if you are not willing to see him freed, if not proven his personal guilty. Jackson's first step was to assemble a staff of colleagues, and on June 6, 1945, after a series of talks in occupied Germany, France, and England, a provisional report was presented by Jackson to President Truman. And soon after, representatives of the four Allied powers met in London, and the conference in London was opened on June 26, and over the following weeks formulated this conference an agreement on the prosecution and punishment of the principal war criminals of the European Axis. Axis, it means also Italy, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. There's the term Axis. Later it was only Germany. Also, this conference formulated an agreement on the prosecution and punishment of the principal war criminals of the European Axis, as well as a constitution of the International Military Tribunal. And this conference ended on August 8, 1955, with the signing of the London Agreement. And it regulated composition, the competence and the proceedings of the International Military Tribunal. Berlin was chosen as a permanent seat for the tribunal. This was a gift of the Jackson to the Soviets, and Nuremberg as a place for the first trial. And then the signatory powers appointed the members of the tribunal, 2 representatives to each of the 4 allied powers, and the main prosecutors. Lord Justice Lawrence represented Great Britain, Francis Biddle's USA, Professor Dondieu de Vabre, France, and General Major Nikitchenko, the USSR. And the principal prosecutors were, for the USA, Robert Jackson, for Great Britain, Sir Hartley Jean Gross, for France, François de Metton, and for the USSR, General Rudienko. And the bill indictment, the London Treaty of the August 8, 1945, had 4 charges. The conspiracy to commit crimes against peace. So it was a new thing for continental law. It's a conspiracy, this idea. Then the planning and beginning of an aggressive war. Then war crimes, that means violations of rules of war and the code of war, the Hague Convention, for instance. And the 4th charge contains crimes against humanity, that means murder, extermination, slavery, abduction, or any other inhumane acts committed against civilian populations before or during the war, mainly in the occupied countries. In Berlin on October 18, 1945, the prosecutors brought charges against 24 individuals and against 6 criminal organizations. That means Hitler's cabinet, the leadership of the Nazi Party, the SS, the party police, and the SD, the security police, the Gestapo, the SA, the General Staff, and the High Command of the Army. The names of the 24 Nazi leaders indicted and tried as war criminals are mentioned in the leaflet relating the IMT you have got. The Nuremberg trials began on November 21st, 1945, with Jackson's opening statement, and nothing said at Nuremberg thereafter matched his force, perception, and eloquence. And indeed, there is nothing else in modern juristic literature that equally projects the controlled passion and moral intensity of many passages. This Jackson's opening statement won wide acclaim, has frequently been reproduced, and is often quoted. Jackson began like this: "The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason." And Jackson continued, it needed 4 hours, more than 4 hours. "We would also make clear that we have no purpose to incriminate the whole German people. If the German populace had willingly accepted the Nazi program, no stormtroopers would have been needed in the early days of the party, and there would have been no need for concentration camps or the Gestapo. The German, no less than the non-German world, has accounts with these defendants. It's a famous sentence in the autumn of 1945, where other people said all the people in Germany is guilty. And Jackson said further, unfortunately, the nature of these crimes is such that both prosecution and judgment must be by victor nations over vanquished foes. The worldwide scope of aggressions carried out by these men has left by few real neutrals. And we must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants is a record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants, he said here, poisoned chalice, is to put it to our lips as well. We must summon such detachment and intellectual integrity to our task that this trial will commend itself to posterity as fulfilling humanity's aspirations to do justice. The last part of Jackson's address was devoted to legal issues, the justification for treating aggressive war as a crime, the personal liability for government officials, the defense of superior orders, and the purpose of indicting the principal Nazi agencies and the General Staff High Command as criminal organizations. And finally, Jackson delivered a moving peroration. He said to the Tribunal, the judges sat here in front of the closed windows and curtains, and Jackson said, the real complaining party at your bar is civilization. In all our countries, it is still a struggling and imperfect thing. Civilization asks whether law is so laggard as to be utterly helpless to deal with crimes of this magnitude by criminals of this order of importance. It does not expect that you, the tribunal, can make war impossible. It does expect that your judicial action will put the forms of international law, its precepts, its prohibitions, and most of all, its sanctions on the side of peace, so that men and women of goodwill in all countries may have leave to live by no means live underneath the law. But before, it was 2nd November, before in autumn 1945, this courtroom was adapted to the necessities of the International Military Tribunal. The rear wall was removed to make the room sufficiently large. And if you see pictures in television or in books and so on, the room is larger than nowadays because the rear wall was off, and there was also a small tribune for spectators, and behind the bar was the international press and so on, and the room was altered. And the windows were closed and the curtain shut, and the judges sat on this right side from your scene, at the right-hand side in front of the windows, where a new bench was established. And on the left side of the bench you see nowadays was the place of the courtroom translation network. For each word of the proceedings was translated into 4 languages simultaneously: German, English, French, and Russian language. And the accused, this translation system, that the birth date of the simultaneous translation of conferences and so on. In former days there was consecutive translation, and here was the first time simultaneous translation, and this system was developed by IBM, and you see the translators had here their places. And the accused, the number was finally 21, said on the left-hand side over there. There is also the door of an elevator, you see it in the wall, which lead to the basement of the house. From there leads a tunnel directly into the basement of the prison in the neighborhood, so that the liberation or an escape of the high-ranked accused was absolutely impossible. And the prosecution, representatives of the four nations, like the judges, had their places in the middle of the courtroom, approximately where the spectators' seating begins now. And from November 20th, 1945, until August 31st, 1906, all sessions of the tribunal were held here in Nuremberg under the presidency of Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence. On 218 days of trials, testimony from 360 witnesses was introduced, some verbal, some written, some from the court itself, some from judges assigned to take testimony. And furthermore, about 200,000 affidavits were evaluated as evidence. The procedures followed Anglo-American practices, and more than 1,000 personnel, some taking testimony, text translators, simultaneous translators, secretaries, and so on, were involved. The Allied prosecutors certainly did not suffer from a lack of evidence, for the members of the Nazi government, of the Nazi regime, had been record keepers even of their sins. Thousands of pages and documents, detailed documents linking the policies and orders of the Nazi leaders to the path of atrocities across Europe were recovered and later used by the IMT. And the public prosecutors brought incriminating evidence regarding the aggressive war against states in Eastern and Western Europe, as well as the cruelties committed by the Einsatzgruppen and the SS in the occupied countries between Leningrad and the Isle of Crimea and the Black Sea. And in that context also massacres were discussed, for instance, Oradour in France, Lidice in Czechoslovakia, or Babi Yar near Kiev in the Ukraine, where more than, on one day, more than 30,000 Jews were killed on September 13th, 1941. And each of the accused Nazi leaders had a German defense lawyer, normally chosen by himself. And during the first months, these defense lawyers had difficulties with the Anglo-American adversarial system, which emphasized active prosecution and defense by lawyers, including extensive direct and cross-examination and presentation of evidence. The strategy of the lawyers went a double way. First of all, they denied the competence of the judges and the legal basis of the IMT, the agreement by the governments of London. The Council for the Defense challenged again and again the validity of the crimes against peace clause in the London Charter. Furthermore, the defense lawyers dealt with the legal question of the trial. They brought in the petition to leave out the count of the offensive war because, they said, at the time the alleged crimes were committed, no sovereign power viewed offensive war as a crime. They argued that no crime can be punished without a pre-existing and operating penal law. That's a Latin principle, nullum crimen, nulla pena sine lege. Another argument of the defense lawyers was the point tu quoque. That means that also the Allied forces had committed war crimes during the war against German soldiers and civilians, air raids, for instance, and so on. All in all, the defense lawyers denied the personal responsibility of the defendants. In some points, the defendant lawyers were successful. For instance, as far as the indictment against the commanders of the German Navy, Dönitz and Rieder was concerned. The defense lawyers argued that after the Pearl Harbor disaster on December 7th of 1941, the Navy of the USA had used the same methods in the Pacific Ocean as the German Navy in the Northern Atlantic. And that refers to the argument tu quoque, you too. The court took evidence. It was a very spectacular thing. The court took evidence by questioning the United States Admiral Nimitz. And the result was positive for both defendants, the Admiral Dönitz and the Admiral Raeder. And two events referring to the USSR were of great importance. First, the treaty between the Deutsches Reich and the USSR, the so-called Ribbentrop-Molotov Treaty of August 23, 1939. On the occasion of this treaty, a non-aggressive pact between Germany and USSR, the Deutsches Reich and the USSR agreed secretly, 8 days before beginning the Second World War, they agreed secretly that Poland and the Baltic states should be divided among themselves. And indeed, after the beginning of the Second World War, that means after the invasion of Poland by German troops on September 1st, 1939, troops of the USSR also invaded Poland on September 17, 1939. And the Russians occupied the eastern part of Poland and imprisoned Polish soldiers. And consequently, so argued the defense lawyers, the USSR had also become guilty of aggression. And therefore, the defense lawyers denied the competence of the Russian judge Nikitchenko. The argument, however, was not admitted in the trial, but the defense lawyer, Dr. Seidel, gave his written document to the members of the international press, and thus the public was informed of the above-mentioned secret treaty between Germany and the USSR of August 1939. By the way, the USSR denied the existence of this secret treaty until the 90s of the last century. Now we have maps with the signature of Molotov and Ribbentrop and the new border between Ukraine and Poland and so on. But until the 90s, it was denied. And second, it was a success of the defendant lawyers. And second, the Katyn murder. The USSR insisted that the murder of nearly 11,000 Polish officers in Katyn near Smolensk had been committed by German troops in autumn 1941. And this murder, however, had been committed by the Soviet troops in spring 1940, when Germany and Russia had been friends. And in this way, to say the Katyn murder is a thing of the German soldiers, in this way, the USSR had intended by the Katyn murder to exterminate the Polish middle and upper class. And the court admitted Jackson had some objection against the petition of the Soviets to take this murder in the accusation. And but he said, if they have evidence, let them do it. But the the Tribune had problems, and the court admitted, with virtual system, 3 witnesses of the defense and of the prosecution. And extremely different statements were the result, naturally. And therefore the problem was not dealt with anymore, but Germany was no longer considered to be guilty of that crime of Katyn, and also the Katyn murder the Soviet Union denied until the end of the 80s of the last century. Nowadays all is clear. These were 2 points among others in which the defense was successful. The defense had not only the position of a statist, they worked. And in these 2 points and others, they were successful. But the quantity and the quality of the documents and the statements offered by witnesses were so overwhelming that the responsibility of the defendants could be proved. One thing must be mentioned. The Holocaust was not an essential topic during the trials. The public prosecutors were more interested in the subject of the aggressive war against European states, such as Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, Norway, Denmark, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Many cruelties committed in these states were discussed, as well as the situation in the occupied Czechoslovakia. The persecution and the murder of Jews in the occupied countries were more occasionally mentioned. The important Holocaust document, the agenda of the so-called Wannsee Conference, January 1942, was not yet known to the prosecutors of the Tribunal in 1945. It was found in 1947. But one man responsible for the murder of the European Jews was on trial, but not as an accused person, but as a witness. His name? Rudolf Höss, the former commander of the concentration camp Auschwitz from 1940 until 1943. Later, in 1947, he was condemned to death by hanging by a Polish court. But in Nuremberg, this Rudolf Höss was only a witness. At his presence, a deathly silence like no other fell over the entire courtroom. Here was a first-hand report from a mass murderer. Amongst other things, Höss said, he said here, beside to the judges, between the judges and the accused persons, he said here as a witness, Höss, he said, in summer of 1941, I was personally ordered to go to Berlin by SS Reichsführer Himmler. He told me what to do. I cannot remember word for word what was said. The Führer, Adolf Hitler, had ordered the start of the final solution, that was the terminus technicus for murdering the Jews, final solution to the Jewish question. And we, the SS, carried out at this order. If it wasn't carried out this particular time, the Jewish people would later eradicate the German people. Therefore, he had chosen Auschwitz because it was easily accessible by train, and the extensive surrounding land area meant that there was sufficient space for barracks. Hess spoke quietly and without emotion, as if he were talking about an everyday matter and not about sending hundreds of thousands of people to their death. Hess' testimony was equally damaging for the defendants and their lawyers. Almost the whole June 1946 was taken up by the final speeches for the defense, 16 days, and for the prosecution, 3 days, during which nothing new came to light. And in his final speech on July 26, 1946, Robert Jackson, representing the American Council for the Prosecution, said among other things, and it is also from the words very important sentences, there are important sentences. He said, if we put together the testimonies of the front row of the members of accused here, we end up with the following satirical overview of Hitler's government. It goes as follows. There's a man, number 2, Göring, who knew nothing about the outrages taking place in the Gestapo organization, of which he was a head, and never adduced anything about the extermination program of the Jews. Also, he was a signatory of over 20 decrees which initiated the persecution of this race. There was a man, number 3, Hess, the deputy of the Adolf Hitler in the Nazi party. The man number 3, who was only an innocent middleman and like a postman or an errand boy, passed on Hitler's orders. A foreign minister, Ribbentrop, who knew little about foreign affairs and hardly anything about foreign politics. A field marshal, General Keitel, a field marshal who conferred orders to the Wehrmacht, having no idea, however, of the practical consequences that would lead to. A head of security, Kaltenbrunner, said the policing activities of the Gestapo and the SD were Kaltenbrunner, who was under the impression that the policing activities of the Gestapo and the SD were on the same level as those of the traffic police. And a party philosopher, Rosenberg, who was interested in historical research and had no conception of the violent acts his philosophy had incited in the 20th century. And a governor of Poland, Frank, who governed but did not rule. And a local governor of Franconia, Streicher, who kept himself occupied with the distribution of slanderous material about the Jews, but had no idea that anyone would read it, and so on. Jackson concluded his speech with the sentence, in view of this background, these defendants today are requesting the court to declare them not guilty of premeditating, executing, and conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and injustice. If you were to say that these men were not guilty, then it would also be true to say that there was no war, no one was killed, and no crimes were committed. Jackson led to the famous drama of Shakespeare, Richard III. And there's a wife and the murderers, and if you say you was not the act, you did not the act, then you can say he's still alive. And so Jackson said, if you say that these men were not guilty, then it would be also true to say that there was no war and no one was killed and no crimes were committed. And the verdicts of the International Military Tribunal were announced on September 30th and October 1st, 1946. It had previously been announced that the reading would require 2 days. In fact, the judgment consisted of 4 principal parts: the description of the rise of Nazism and the evidence against the defendants took the morning and the part of the afternoon on September 30th, and the charges against the organizations, High Command, SS, SR, and so on, took the rest of the afternoon, and the decisions on the guilt or innocence of the individual defendants took the morning of October 1st, and the penalties to be inflicted on the guilty defendants were announced that afternoon, after all. October 1st, 1946 was real Judgment Day, which the defense and not few judges and prosecutors had been treating. In the morning, the tribunal would announce for each defendant which if any of the 4 counts he had criminally violated, and in the afternoon the tribunal would announce for each convicted defendant the penalty to be imposed. The verdicts ended with 3 acquittals. Von Papen, he was in former times vice chancellor of the Hitler's government. Then Schacht, he was the president of the German Reichsbank. And Fritzsche, he was a person in the Ministry of Propaganda. And these 3 men were acquitted, but later times they got entnazification and so on. But they were acquitted, and the reason why the tribunal took not the years between 1933 until 1945, but they had a smaller time frame from 1939, the time during the war. They had the tribunal, and therefore, at the time 1939 until 1954, these 3 persons, Papen and Schacht, they were not important to the Nazi regime, and Fritzsche was a man of the press, and therefore he was acquitted. And 7 sentences of life imprisonment or to lesser terms, and 12 sentences to death by hanging. And the sentences of death by hanging were executed against 10 persons in the old gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison in the early morning of October 16, 1946. Bormann, Hitler's secretary, was never found. He was indicted in absentia, and Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Air Force and so on, committed suicide in the night before his execution. Perhaps he got the poison of his watchman, the American Lieutenant Willis from Texas. Telford Taylor writes this fact in his book, Nuremberg Process. And the bodies of the hanged persons, 10, and the body of Göring, who had committed suicide, were subsequently cremated in Munich, incognito, and the ashes were also incognito strewn in an estuary of the river Isar in Munich. All is off. The events which culminated in the judgment by the International Military Tribunal began in the late summer of 1944 in the United States War Department in Washington and ended in the tribunal's judgment in October 1946 in Nuremberg. The 21 defendants who were thus judged were a mere handful compared to the thousands who have been charged with crimes perpetrated in connection with the Second World War. To chronicle and assess the significance of all these cases would spread a huge canvas of memory and misery over virtually the whole of Eurasia. But the International Military Tribunal, so small in the number of defendants, was and has remained the most striking and important trial and has become known as Nuremberg, a name which conjures up the moral and legal issues raised by applying judicial methods and decisions to challenge wartime acts. Nuremberg was in part revolutionary in the sense that its makers, mainly Jackson, adopted several novel criminal principles. Contrary to the original plans, no subsequent international tribunal took place. And from 1947 until 1949, 12 United States military trials involving politicians, military personnel, businessmen, lawyers, doctors, industrialists, and so on, were held here in Nuremberg, in this room and in another room in the Palace of Justice. Similar trials were conducted in the French, British and Soviet zones of occupation until the year 1949, where the two German states got some independence from the the Allied forces. To understand the importance of the Nuremberg trials, let's listen to Birgit, one of the United States judges. He wrote to a friend in January 1946, the early days of the Tribunal, and he wrote, Birgit, "The thing that sustains me is the knowledge that these trials can be a very great landmark in the history of international law. There will be a precedent of the highest standing for all successive generations, and aggressor nations, great and small, will embark on war with a certain knowledge that if they fail, they will be held to grim account. Moreover, immediately after the Second World War, the IMT worked up history. The statements of about 200,000 witnesses and the examination and investigation of a lot of tons of German documents soon after the war were important for the historians, but also for the German people at that time and later, many of whom had never heard of all the cruelties done by the Nazi leaders and their members. Moreover, we must not forget that the IMT is a milestone on the way to the Bosnia Tribunal in The Hague, on the Rwanda Tribunal in Arusha, Tanzania, and to the establishment of an international criminal court in The Hague, according to the Statute of Rome on July 1998. The final question is, was the IMT successful? Was it a success? Its creation raised many different desires, and there have been various tests of success. Unfortunately, it could not prevent any further wars, but the fact that there was a tribunal was certainly better than would have been the mere execution of the Nazi leaders, which had been planned in 1942, 43, not also in the Soviet Union, but also in Roosevelt and Churchill. Its most important result is perhaps this. Since Nuremberg, it has been clear that not only the states, but also the politicians, military personnel, and others are responsible for crimes against peace and humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cochran. By the way, you need to know that his speech evoked a lot of interesting thoughts in my mind as I'm flowing through. One is he lived Nuremberg. So during the course of the bombing, as a young child, he lived it. He was here. He saw this. So I mean,
I didn't see it.
Yeah.
But I lived here.
Lived here. So I mean, the process here. And as he was talking about Rudolf Hirsch, the interrogation, talking about Ernst Kaltenbrunner, talking about the fact of the ultimate hanging here, Whitney Harris lived all that. Whitney Harris brought the case against Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Whitney Harris was the one who got the deposition of Rudolf Hirsch, which you would describe, and of course, Whitney Harris was the designee of Robert Jackson to attend to the actual hanging. But most important, what I'm going to do is surprise and ask Father Fuchs if he could maybe come up here. He lived it. And there are some pictures in your book of him. And to the extent that I'm dying to hear what you think, as you sit here today, 60 years later, with the emotion that you're currently having, if you want to take a second, Father Fuchs, and maybe come up and share them with us.
people of the city here at Nuremberg deserve a great compliment for continuing this place as a place of justice and peace. I was impressed by the little sign on the front of this lectern here, Nuremberg, the city of peace and human rights. Very good. There are some outstanding places recognizable here, though I think they've shrunk somewhat, the corner here where the defendants were, but the doors there and the door here where they walk through, very much the same. I was impressed, too, with some of the items that were brought up here by our speaker about the shuffling off, disowning of responsibility for the Katyn forest massacre. That was quite a clear thing. It has subsequently, just about 10 years ago, been acknowledged by the Soviets that they did it. It took a long time for them to admit that publicly. And, of course, that other issue of dividing Poland between the Germans and the Russians, that secret document, I'm glad you clarified that very nicely. My overall impression, and at the time I was just 20 years old, just a youngster, and had obviously no experience in law, and anyway, I hadn't been to jail myself either. But the process and the vision that Jackson had and shared with those four main countries, supported by another, I don't know, 25 or 30 other countries, I think there were a vindication of the consensus of humanity of what's right and what isn't wrong. And the great honor goes to Jackson for making it clear in some legal language what people can understand about what's right and wrong. And he simply made it possible to put it in language that we're all accountable for our choices. You just can't say someone else told me to do it. If you recognize it as wrong, even though you might be punished, then you have to accept personal responsibility. Awesome to do that. And to extend it all the way to organizations, I think was obviously a thrust into a responsibility that all of us have. If you belong to the Boy Scouts, then you can accept the things that go nicely with the Boy Scouts. And also if there are things about them that are not right, well, it's part of what you accept by being a member. So that seemed, he clarified a lot of that for us. But the essential thing about Nuremberg is there is accountability for our choices. And it goes all the way back to some illustrations here of the Ten Commandments, which were respected in this courtroom. I've seen, and I have seen of all things, a very obviously Christian symbol of the crucifixion. That certainly wasn't here when we were there, but it's another tribute to the people of the city coming up with something like that. An accountability to someone other and greater than ourselves is being lost in a lot of society. We have to acknowledge that, and especially, I'm thinking for those of you who are Americans, we stand in a very critical time right now, too. If we don't regain that vision of accountability for choices, political correctness will not save us. We have to do the right thing. Looking good is not enough. And so we want to ask ourselves to follow through and become more acquainted with the core teachings of or decisions of the Nuremberg trial so that we can gain from them and persuade ourselves that we have to follow through on what's right. I think it's a great tribute to Jackson and to the whole system that took place here, that might is not right. It ain't necessarily so. Right is right. And just because we got the power to do things doesn't mean we're doing the right thing. David and Goliath, a good example for us. Okay? Thank you.